Hey guys, Warren here. Welcome to my channel today. I have a special guest with us today from overseas. He's going to tell us a little bit about himself a little bit later, but he's really knowledgeable on the Puritans. So we're going to have a discussion about the Puritans today. Welcome, Andre.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Warren. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Pleasure. Lovely to see you again after so many years.
Yeah,
Tell us a little bit about it. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in PE, obviously, and sort of went through the kind of ordination process in the UPCSA, but then for various reasons pulled out, and instead came to the UK to pursue further studies and further training. Ended up doing a kind of apprenticeship. I worked as a kind of assistant pastor at Green Acres Presbyterian Church in Port Elizabeth. And then I came over here and worked as an associate at St. Helens Bishopsgate. So if anybody knows anything about the UK evangelical scene, then they'll know about St. Helens Bishopsgate and the Proclamation Trust. And it's kind of the center of kind of expository preaching throughout the UK. One of the key places where people go to develop that skill. And then after that, worked part-time as an assistant pastor at Grove Hill Evangelical Church and studied part-time at Oak Hill Theological College, and then which is in London, and then came to Bethesda Baptist Church, where I'm currently pastor of a kind of small to medium-sized church on a seaside town. It's about the size of Jeffreys Bay, but a lot further north. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And married?
Married, 4 kids,
wow.
2 rabbits, and a guinea pig.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that with us. Yeah. And so it's Ireland, eh?
No, England.
Oh, okay. So England. So we're playing you on Saturday.
That's right. I'm really looking forward to that. Yes, I've invited a whole bunch of folks from the church to come over and watch South Africa, whip England live on television.
Let's hope
so. I think they will. I'm confident.
Yeah, they've just announced the side. I was looking at the side now. Okay, can you tell us a little bit about who were the Puritans?
Yeah, so Puritans were, first of all, thank you for introducing me as being very knowledgeable on the Puritans. I would like to just caveat that by saying I really enjoy reading the Puritans and have enjoyed reading the Puritans. And all my knowledge is kind of, just from me enjoying them. I haven't sort of studied Puritanism or anything like that. So I'm not an expert, but the Puritan, I guess one way of thinking about the Puritans is just that they were the evangelicals of their time. So they were Reformed evangelicals. They were from about the 1550s to the 1650s was about the kind of golden age of Puritanism, I think. And it was kind of following on from the Reformation. So after the Reformers did their work, sort of the Puritans then came in and continued that work further. So I guess it's a continuation of the Reformation in one sense, and a kind of development of it. It had a slightly sort of pietistic feel about it. So it was more trying to, whereas the Reformers, although they were also concerned with godliness and holiness and relationship with God, they were, I guess, fighting chiefly theological battles at that time. And the Puritans, I think, came along and built on that and continued to develop that theology, but also began to sort of apply it and push the kind of application of, well, if we believe these great Reformed doctrines, then what impact is that going to have on the way that we actually live and our love for God? And so the kind of tone of Puritan writings is obviously often very sort of inclined towards our experience as Christians and how we live rightly before God and our love for him and our devotion to him. And so sort of explored the kind of piety of Reformed theology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does.
That's how I understand it anyway.
Okay. So technically, people like Jonathan Edwards, Charles Spurgeon, J.C. Ryle, Martin Lloyd-Jones were not
Yeah.
Puritans, but they had Puritan inclinations, a love for their type of theology.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's fair. Some people would class them as Puritans, and I think that, I'm okay with that. I think the kind of Puritan era was before them, but they were definitely carrying on in the spirit of it. They had the same kind of thing, that basically Reformed or Reformation doctrine, Calvinistic doctrine, that you find in sort of the Westminster Standards and that kind of thing. But sort of developing and focusing on what that meant for our spirituality, I'd say. So especially with guys like Edwards, you see a lot of that, a lot of that emphasis. So I think whereas the reformers maybe were slightly more, I mean, these are sweeping generalizations. You get exceptions to everything I'm saying here, but whereas the reformers, I think, were on the whole slightly more interested in or more focused on the objective work of the gospel. I think the Puritans and guys like Edwards and even Spurgeon, who was much later. So I think Edwards was like a century. So if we talk about the Puritans being 1550 to 1650, I think Edwards was like a century after that, and then Spurgeon was like a century after that. So Spurgeon's pretty much late. Probably too late to be technically classed as a Puritan for sure. But because he was sort of continuing in that vein, he sounds very much like a Puritan, the way that he preached, the way that he thought. And even some guys today, if you read them today, they sound just like Puritans, because that whole kind of sweep from the Reformation to the Puritans, to the kind of Great Awakenings and the revivals through to evangelicalism today, that's kind of like one continuous sweep. And where you can trace that kind of thread going back, and then arguably all the way back to the New Testament. But yeah, so that it's all part of the same sort of cut from the same cloth, if you like.
When about did your love for the Puritans come about? Would you say?
I say it was partly the minister of our church at Greenacres Presby. I think Rory's still there. I think Rory Spence. So I think he I don't, sort of in the way that he does, kind of like sort of half joking, half trying to tease me, called me a Puritan a few times. And so I thought and then sort of suggested that I read some of these great Puritans like John Owen. And I used to walk into his library and sort of covet his Puritan works. And every now and again, I laughed because I pulled a book out of my library the other day and it actually has his name in it. So I obviously did pinch one of them.
He might see this video.
That's right. Well, I think, anyway, he knows the risks that he took leaving those books unguarded. So but I think in that sense, so he basically he encouraged me to read some of the reformers and read a bit more in depth about from that sort of the Puritans, the reformers, and that kind of thing. And so he really got me into it. And the book that I took from his shelf and read from, it was called The Genius of Puritanism by Peter Lewis. And that's the book that really got me hooked on it, because I was just blown away by it. I remember just sitting in my little flat in Central and sort of reading the book and just kind of like copying out word for word the quotes from the Puritans in it, because I just found them so amazing. So I've been basically rewriting the book into my notebook, just because I thought the quotes that he was putting in there were just, just remarkable. I guess it just struck by how different it was, how much deeper it was to the kind of general culture of evangelicalism at the time. It just felt the kind of the way people thought about God, the way people thought about Christianity, the way people thought about the scriptures, which it just seems so superficial, myself included, in comparison to reading in that book. And so that really got me hooked onto it. And so I went from there. I started accumulating Puritan paperbacks whenever I could get hold of them, and then would just try and work through them. It was hard work at at times, but yeah.
Trust books.
Yes, a lot of Banner Trust stuff. I mean, I was also getting into guys like John MacArthur at the time, and I think Spurgeon, and so they were always quoting from Puritans, and so I was getting sort of an in from that way as well. A little bit later on, I started to kind of discover some of John Piper's preaching and the historical biographies that he did. I don't know if you've ever heard his biographies. You can get them free on his website.
Some of them online,
They're excellent. They're really good. In fact, I think of all the things John Piper has done, those are the best. Those are his most valuable contribution to me. But yeah, so he was a big Edwards fan, and so got me onto Edwards and into the Puritans that way as well. So
even Mark Deaver would also be a guy that likes the Puritans. Practical lessons we can learn from the Puritans.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things that what struck me immediately when I was reading that Genius of Puritanism, and has kind of remained with me since, was just how highly they regarded the glory of God, the holiness of God, and that view of God, just so much bigger than I think was common in the kind of Christian circles that I was moving in, the kind of basic evangelical stuff in South Africa, and just sort of really struck by that, just how they feared God in a good way. That they had a real sense of what holiness and reverence and awe for God would look like, and that had a profound impact on me. And then the kind of, I think it was Calvin who said that knowledge of God and knowledge of self go hand in hand, and if one is sort of deficient, then the other is also going to suffer. And I think I found that to be true as well. So the Puritans had a very high view of God, and also a very honest assessment of themselves in the light of God's holiness. And so I think those two things are really, really important, just in terms of creating a general atmosphere or a culture of understanding just how great God is, but also how we need God's grace and forgiveness because of our own sinfulness. And so how central the whole idea of repentance and forgiveness and confession and grace and all those things are to our walk with God, because God is holy and we're not.
Awesome. How do we start reading the Puritans? Do we start with books, articles? I know Joel Beakey is one of the
yes.
guys on Puritanism now. Mark Jones, Ian Murray, Martin Lloyd-Jones has also written a couple of things.
Yeah.
You spoke about the Puritan paperbacks. And some of the complete works of the Puritans, that will be heavy going to start with. Free ebooks are available. Puritan prayer books.
Yeah, actually, I think that is that Valley of Vision sort of anthology of Puritan prayers. I think that might be a great place to start, because it gives you a kind of flavor of the spirituality of the Puritans. And the good thing about it is, because let's be honest, with every movement, there's kind of the good and the bad. And with the Puritans, that's also true. So there are Puritans who I think drift very dangerously into a kind of legalistic tone. So not all of the Puritans are equally worthwhile, in my opinion. In fact, some of the Puritans I discovered sort of as I drudged through. I didn't want to see it at first, but I came to recognize that some of the Puritans really, I thought, were flirting dangerously with legalism at times. So there's a Puritan paperback called A Christian's Guide to Heaven, or A Sure Guide to Heaven. And I read that one early on, and it terrified me. It terrified the daylights out of me, because I thought, if that's a sure guide to heaven, I am definitely not going. There is no chance I am making it on that sure guide to heaven. And I don't know if I just misunderstood the book or something, but I've since discovered that there is a bit of a trend in some Puritans to so overemphasize kind of the importance of living a devout and holy life that they do diminish kind of God's grace and all He's achieved for us in the gospel. And I think some of the modern authors, you mentioned, so Joel, you mentioned Mark Jones. And for me, Mark Jones dabbles a little, veers slightly. I wouldn't call him a legalist, but for me, he swings this way. He leans this way a little bit. I'm a little bit worried about some of the stuff that he said. And I think that's reflected in some of the Puritans. There's a great book by Sinclair Ferguson called, gotta try and remember what it's called now. I think it's called The Whole Christ. And it's about some of the theological debates and arguments had between Puritans in Scotland over the nature of the gospel and over forgiveness. And I think that book just highlights how we shouldn't take for granted that just because some of the Puritans were glorious, most of them were, that all of them were on the same page. I think some of them were dangerously wrong in some areas. So that's just something to be aware of. But the great thing of something like the Valley of Vision is it takes the best of the Puritans and sticks them together into a prayer book, or something like The Genius of Puritanism. It's quite an old book now, so you might want to go for something slightly more recent. I know Packard did a kind of introduction to the Puritans on Giant Shoulders or something like that. So, or Among God's Giants, I think it might be called. And then Joel Beakey recently has put out some stuff on the Puritans as well. Puritan yes, theology. He's got a Puritan theology, and he's got a kind of general introduction to the Puritans. So that you know, I think so, reading something like that, because when you're picking up a Puritan paperback, which Banner of Truth put out, and they're like these little abridged versions of the Puritans. And if you're going to read the original sources, I'd say that's definitely the way to go. But it is quite a shifting gear. So you have to just give yourself a bit of time to kind of settle into the rhythm of the way that they spoke back then. Yeah. So you just kind of have to push through the first couple of chapters where it just seems so strange and so weird and so formal, and you're having to reread sentences all the time just to make sure you've understood it and things like that. If you just push through that bit, then you start to enter into that kind of language, and it starts to feel a bit more natural, and then you start to enjoy it a little bit more. So, I mean, Pilgrim's Progress, I think, is a classic example of this. So Pilgrim's Progress is to date the only Christian book that ever made me cry. and it's written in not very easy language to understand. But if you just sort of keep pushing at it, eventually you start to enter into that world, and it starts to sound a little bit more familiar. And then you start to make sense, but you have to persevere with it a little bit. But because of that, maybe starting with someone's introduction would be a helpful way to go, because he'll quote something and explain it, and so it has sort of modern language and sort of Victorian English mixed in together. So
I know that you spoke about Sibbs, Richard Sibbs, and John
Owen.
Now, John Owen could be quite difficult to read if one just starts with him. So which would be, I mean, that would, for you, would be the best guys, Owen. But who would be the easiest to start with? Bunyan?
Yeah, maybe a Bunyan.
Watson?
I was just thinking Bunyan. Bunyan would be a good start.
I know I've got Manton's 3-volume, his initial 3-volume, it then became a 22-volume work that they put out, but it's basically all sermons.
Yes.
But he's one of the better preachers of the Puritans.
Yes.
But we could look at Goodwin, Henry, Burroughs, Perkins, Baxter, Trail. You know, there's quite a few of them. But to start with an easier guy, because Owen certainly would be hard to start with, I think.
So the thing about, John Owen for me is the best, just because John Owen actually said about John Bunyan that he would trade all of his learning to be able to preach like John Bunyan.
Yeah.
And I think the thing is, that sort of desire to genuinely serve the kingdom is there all the way through John Owen's writing. So he gets very technical and very precise. But there is, I think, no more important book for a Christian to read from the Puritans, and this is a big claim, I know, but there is, I think, no more important book. That probably the most helpful book that has ever been written on growing in the Christian life is John Owen's Mortification of Sin. And again, you can read modern versions of it that have been brought out. John Owen's stuff, I think Sinclair Ferguson, again, he's done his own sort of translation of John Owen's stuff into modern English, which is, so I don't know how many he did in the end, but I know he's definitely got one on John Owen's famous work, which is the on communion with God, communion with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I think that's very important as well. And so you could start with something like that, where it's kind of a modern translation. It's John Owen, but it's just been translated into modern English. And so you could start with his, it's a paperback. It's I guess a medium-sized book. It's not a huge thing. And he's got one on the Holy Spirit and one on communion with God. At least those are the two of his that I've read. And I've sort of lost touch with the modern versions after that. So that might be a good place to go. Bunyan would be, I think, a slightly easier, in terms of his English, would be easier to read than Owen for sure. Sibbs, The Bruised Reed, is a Puritan paperback, which I think every Christian should read. There are a few books that offer as much comfort for people who are feeling their own guilt and shame, and feeling their own weakness. The Bruised Reed is a fantastic sort of salve for the soul to comfort you and to keep you going. So yeah, I think I'd start probably there. I'd go to one of those Sinclair Ferguson translations of John Owen. I'd go to The Bruised Reed, and I'd go to something of Bunyan's, perhaps Pilgrim's Progress to start with, and then go from there. Definitely, if anyone is watching this and they haven't read Pilgrim's Progress, like, just stop watching this and go do that now, and stop wasting your life. And then we can have a conversation about what else you read. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So monogerism, how do you pronounce that?
Monogism.
Monogism have quite a few free ebooks available of the Puritans. But I battle a bit. I don't know about you reading ebooks. I prefer a physical copy in my hands. But it is an option, certainly, for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's all it's all free, and CCEL as well is another website where you can get this kind of stuff for free. The Christian Classics Ethereal Library is, and you can get all sorts on there. So yeah, monogism is a great resource. I think it is worth checking out Piper's biographies on it. And I think reading the Puritans, William Perkins, I think, is another great one to read. They just, something I've started to get very interested in recently is how, as Protestants, we don't really tend to read anything before the Reformation. So for us, Christianity at a functional level kind of started in the 1500s, which of course is absurd. Christianity has been around for ages, and the Reformers never thought that. They used to quote all the often from early church fathers, especially St. Augustine, but others as well. And I think I think when you look at guys like Perkins and Owen, you see how well they knew those church fathers, the medieval writers, and how much they referenced them and showed that what they were saying was in continuity with what came before. And that's another added bonus, because I think today, the further along we go, there's a kind of revival of it now, where we're starting to wake up as evangelicals to the fact that the church isn't 500 years old, but 2,000 odd years old, and so we do need to go further back to find out the truth of what God has revealed and what he's been up to in the world, and to be able to stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us, not kind of reinvent the wheel, but actually listen to the voices of Christians before us. And so, but the Puritans, like William Perkins, I'm thinking particularly of, and John Owen, they do that very well. And I think that's just another advantage to reading them. But yeah. I can't remember what you asked me. I've just rambled on about something else, but
thanks so much. We need to close it, yeah. But thank you so much for coming on to the channel and sharing with us. And I'm hoping to get you on the channel again, by the way, for something
pleasure.
further along down the line. But this has really been awesome. It's so great to touch base with you again. And
yeah, it's great to see you.
There in England. And up to the box on Saturday.
Yes, looking forward to it. Yeah.
God bless, eh?
Great. God bless.
Cheers. Thanks, Andre.